Welcome to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. I'm Stan Wisseman with my co-host Rob Aragao. And Rob, we have something exciting on the horizon, don't we?
We do actually. On May 15th, you and I will be doing almost like a live format of the podcast, right, Stan?
So our listeners can not only just hear us, but they can see us and they can also pepper us with questions live.
That's right. Come one, come all. So we're doing this Smarter Insights webinar series that we've been invited to. And we're going to cover the topic of cyber risk posture management. So it goes across multiple areas, obviously, of cyber. But yeah, for those that would love to come and join and participate and pepper the questions, we're going to be there.
We'll put the link in the show notes. I can't remember the time of the webinar. Rob, do you happen to have that on your fingertips?
11 a.m. Eastern.
So again, hopefully you can join us. Today, though, Rob, we're going to dive into the world of, well, we're going to hit a number of different topics, right? But we're going to hit smart contracts and the world of decentralized finance. It's something that I haven't really been that exposed to. I wrote a blog about it recently and sort of learned more about it. And the reason I did the blog and I want to talk about it is that it is a hot space in the sense of people trying things out, to implement it, but also there have been a lot of incidents, so it's one of those things where it's an rapidly evolving area. At the same time, there are a lot of threat actors that are looking at it and probing for weaknesses and finding some to exploit.
So Stan, why don't you kick us off then into that topic and, just kind of give everyone a foundation in essence around smart contracts and DeFi in general.
Well, Rob, let's start there with smart contracts. So basically it's a contract, just like any other contract, right? But it's written in code. So if you think about trying to capture, all that contract language in the code, and the fact that it will then self-execute without the need of anybody overseeing the process, that really is the key here. And it's all based on blockchain technology, and these contracts operate automatically, and they drastically reduce reliance on intermediaries like lawyers or brokers. So there's those that really believe that this, approach, and this is where decentralized finance or DeFi comes in. It could be a game changer. It could really revolutionize how we do finance. So a lot of these contracts are written in Solidity. It's a programming language that's tailored for contracts on blockchain platforms like Ethereum. And Ethereum is one of those platforms that sort of is the basis for this whole thing, So I wish I had a whiteboard. This is one of those instances. It'd be nice to share a PowerPoint slide or have some kind of way of visually representing things. But imagine that you could do all these different financial services, right? You could do loans, you could exchange assets, all your fingertips through your digital wallet.
Mm-hmm.
So no banks, no brokers, no intermediaries dictating terms or collecting fees. And it sort of is democratizing,
right?
The access to financial services. And it's one of the big things is also that it's transparent. You can see the contract, you can see the code, but that's also part of the issue as far as the fact that, with this reliance of smart contracts, there are also some risks, right? And everything runs on code, and any flaw or bug in that code could have implications and affects the outcome for the user, and that impacts the trust of the whole system. And so, one of the things that we're seeing is that some of these bad actors are taking advantage of some of those flaws or, exploits.
Well, you talked about the flaws, the exploits, and more from the software side of things, right? Are there any examples, anything that you've seen out there that would be kind of a good example to share with the audience of the potential vulnerabilities within looking at things in the smart contract area?
Yeah. I mean, there are a number of different ones out there. I mean, some of the common types of attacks are related to things called like flash loan manipulation, or attacks due to human errors, like I mentioned. But there are specific vulnerability types or logic flows in the contracts that can be exploited. One of the poster children of attacks is the DAO attack or hack. It really was a compromise of a smart contract that was, the complexities allowed the exploit, and it resulted in $50 million worth of money being lost in that particular hack. There are other ones where there are insiders that have been actually part of the hack. And one of the things that again brought it to my attention was there was a real spike of incidents that occurred in March. That ultimately, exceeded in aggregate over $100 million worth of money lost through these exploits. And so a variety of different issues, like whether it be a weakness in an algorithm or, vulnerabilities in an outdated contract, it was a variety of different things that you can't put your finger on one thing as being the cause. It wasn't like a log4j kind of issue, right? It was just obviously the threat actors are looking very carefully at this new way of doing finance.
Yeah, and I know there was one previous, like back in 2021, they were on the Poly network and that hack. And I thought that was interesting in looking at that one, right? Because that was over 600 million, right? Stolen digital tokens in essence. But in the end, the attacker basically was just trying to point out the flaw that was found. And kind of maybe quote unquote, the negotiation that occurred, they basically said, hey, listen, I'm a good person. I'm just trying to tell you, this is where you have an issue and, the things that you need to maybe potentially do to resolve that. And so, he gave back what he initially took and kind of just kept a bug bounty, if you will, of about $500,000 back for, the finding to be able to kind of help drive that. But his point was, hey, listen, again, I'm not here as a bad person. I'm just showing you as an example,
making
where there's a problem. Yeah. And basically taking that bug bounty portion back of about $500,000. So, it's still a very, very early space that people are trying to basically figure out how to properly secure. And there's a lot of embedded security, obviously, within there too in the blockchain. But
there is. And one of the practices to mitigate risks is, thorough auditing of these. It's sort of like a safety certification in the traditional industries, right? I mean, by conducting an audit, you're looking for any kind of anomalies in the logic. You're looking for potential known vulnerabilities, but it doesn't necessarily, guarantee that a contract is entirely free of vulnerabilities, because there are complexities and there are human errors in coding, right? So, but that the audit process is evolving as well. So you have a manual method of doing it, right? And that is very methodical in the sense that you have experts that know what they're doing typically. Now, granted, those are hard to find, but they know how to catch the nuances and some of these vulnerabilities that are well known, but it's very time consuming. They're going to catch things like logic flaws that you won't be able to necessarily catch in automated scans, right? But automated scans can certainly be more repeatable, and it has some kind of structure of hitting known vulnerabilities. You're going to look for certain things, just like any static code analysis, right? And so there's an advantage, I think, of pairing them up. You want to have both the automated scans, and it's a time saver, as well as augment that with manual scans, and hopefully that will help you mitigate some of the concerns you have about your smart contracts. But it's a continuous process, right? I mean, it's like any of these things we've talked about, where it's a cat and mouse thing, where the threat actors are looking for new ways of exploiting the system, and you on the defensive side as a developer need to work collaboratively with the community. It's sort of like, again, open source projects where you have hopefully a healthy project community that can work together and identify and flag things quickly. I think we need to adapt to the threats as they come in.
Yeah, for sure. And this will definitely be a topic that we'll cover off in the future. Again, it's still very early in its stages of where the cyber kind of components are starting to play a critical role. So one other thing I wanted to discuss today, Stan, and you've been a part of this too. So within our organization that we're part of within OpenText, we've been doing these different cybersecurity roadshows, if you will, and a lot of it's been about pulling in parts of our network in these conversations and fireside chats that we've been bringing across different cities. In a way, it's almost like the podcast on the road, but we're kind of doing it individualized, right?
Right.
And earlier in the week, I was having some conversations with a few other folks and broken up fireside chats. A couple we've actually had in the past. Ideal Saeed, we had from Kyndryl, CTO, Ed Amoroso, right, from Tag Infosphere, and another gentleman who's a good friend, Neil Schloth, who's actually over at Fiserv as their head of application security. And we broke them up into kind of two different conversations. Neil and Adil, what I did basically with them is we really were very kind of over the top of cyber. What are you seeing? What are some of the different things that are working? One of the main emphasis points that we drove into was around this cybersecurity programs and that buy-in that you need from the executive level. Adil touched upon that pretty heavily. A lot of the themes
around budgeting or just in
around
general?
budgeting. We talked about, like we did not that long ago, we talked about, some of the things you need to do to get the budget in place versus, geez, now the events occurred and now all of a sudden I have kind of this free flow of money that comes in to do the things I want to do. Or, hey, the, third party has come in to point out the areas that, we've already identified our security controls we're trying to put into place, but because they told us, like, we're going to go do it now. So it was just an interesting conversation, but a lot of it was actually, very much driven around that maturation process of how you actually, don't try to bite off too much coming out of the gates, especially, from Neil's perspective, as they were launching into their application security program several years back, just being very poignant on what they were going to do, getting, really good coverage of some of the key applications and what they wanted to be able to take a look at to pinpoint security vulnerabilities, but also that kind of fine line of how do they balance that by being able to work very effectively with the development teams.
So is that basically not to burn the program? And so you had a good foundation and some quick wins, or what was the motivation for not biting off too much? Because obviously you come in and you could see there's so much we can do.
A lot. Yeah. Let's say there's a lot of fires we can put out, is what kind of, you'll see initially, but they just want it to be very much in a manner of setting things up very strategically so they can say, okay, we're not going to go for the top application per se right out of the gates, right? We're going to go for kind of like just underneath those. And we're going to show that this is how we can approach it mutually, right, with the development teams at our side, get them on board. And once we get them on board, right, we should be able to actually take that model to then go across much more higher
positive buzz, right? And get some,
you need to get them on board.
Exactly.
Which was part of the conversation around culture too, right? And so we even discussed, the aspect of, we know that in cyber, it's a very competitive landscape. So, kind of this consistency of the program with people potentially moving around quite a bit, not just within your organization to other, potentially higher paying jobs that pop up left and right. And, ensuring again that relationship stays in place across the different stakeholders. So a lot of that was more about non-technical per se conversation, that were, hey, how do we actually marry these things together? How do we actually show that we're working very effectively? And also how do we handle the outside world of the regulators coming in and knocking our doors all the time, being a financial services organization, right? So that was a lot more of what that conversation kind of was around with him. As I mentioned with the deal, it was, kind of this framing back into that whole resiliency aspect. And, he was just talking about some of the past experiences he's had, but, a lot of the conversation was much more about the conversations that he's now having with different organizations that they support at Kyndryl. And a lot of it absolutely is still being driven by different, regulations. And he was talking about, which he did actually on our episode, if I recall correctly, DORA, right? The Digital Operation Resiliency Act that we covered up.
That really is being a driver for folks as far as trying to get ready for DORA compliance.
It is. And again, that's a financial sector specific, right? That's driven out of the EU. But, anyone that's doing any sort of financial business in the EU falls underneath that regulation. So that is actually moving the needle. The other thing that he called out, which I thought was very interesting, because again, he's very much focused on the commercial sector, was the, utilization of some things from the federal government and some of the kind of pulling the levers, like on the continuous diagnostics and monitoring capabilities and management capabilities, right? And so maybe it's more of like a framework approach that seems to be resonating, but just it was an interesting kind of crossover between some of those things that actually have come out of federal sector to drive back in and be applicable.
What about Ed? I mean, Ed, we had such a great conversation with Ed when he was on. And
we did.
And imagine you could spend the whole time just talking to him.
Oh yeah. So he was the second part of our conversation. So had great fireside chat with Ed. Our focus with Ed was around AI, right? And so it was a lot more around, he gave examples. They at TAG have recently completed about 45 different client engagements with some very large organizations and mid-sized organizations as well. And it's a lot more about where do you get started with AI, adopting, the program, starting to build it out. And what he really said, he said it's a bunch of different wildfires. It's a bunch of different, these different things that are being spun up in parts of their organization. HR is doing it, finance is doing it. No one has any sort of control or governance over it, right? It's very, very kind of Wild West approach. He also kind of painted a pretty interesting analogy. And he goes, for those who recall and remember basically kind of the beginning of, the web browser, the beginning of the search engine out there, the Alta Vistas of the world, Ask Jeeves of the world.
The mid 90s, right? The early mid 90s.
When you're just getting started, and what are we doing with this? How are we going to use it? And people just continuously kind of started planning and become, more understanding of what value it can return for them, right? And he painted that analogy of that's pretty much where we are now. He was very much of the perspective, don't slow things down, be very security minded, but allow people to go and utilize and try to innovate without putting, all these different kind of control mechanisms in place that's just continuously holding back, if you will.
For competitive reasons, they can't, in this case, fall too far behind, right? I mean,
absolutely.
But there are cautionary tales, I imagine, as far as the sensitive data being ingested into these AIs, and if you don't have guardrails as far as what is appropriate, it's a black box. Once that data is in, you can't get it back out.
Yeah, and that was one of the other points of topic of conversation with him was, where do you get started with actually the data that you're going to leverage when you're doing your own, LLMs, public or private? What are you doing to get started to ensure, to do your best you can to ensure that the data is properly secured, that you don't have privacy risks associated to it, which is very difficult to do. But we got into some of that conversation about, maybe creating kind of that sandbox first of where the data goes into, and then being able to push that back out. And now you have this kind of quote unquote approved or sanitized set of information that you're actually using within your production, large language models. So very early, very interesting to kind of hear the points of different organizations, because he's had, again, like you mentioned, 45 different organizations they've been engaging. Wow. But just really a lot of those conversations, again, it was asking, where do we start, right? And who are the stakeholders that need to be involved, and just pulling it all together. So still really early on.
Did he see a role for the cybersecurity team as being sort of that guardrailed establisher? I mean, again, you mentioned the Wild Wild West. I mean, who has that role to determine what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate?
So not per se cybersecurity as the kind of one only, voice, if you will.
It's a combination.
It was a combination, absolutely, of, the data office, if you will, and if there's a chief data officer in the organization, the privacy side of the organization with legal and compliance, kind of being at the table, being aware of what you're planning to do, what you're planning to use, security absolutely being there, technology from a CIO, CTO level as well. But yet he didn't kind of call out and say, this is kind of who the end all should be in governing all of that. There probably
isn't any obvious answer. It depends on the organization, right?
Again, it's depending on the organization. It's so spread out, it's still so early on. But anytime you talk to Ed, I mean, the conversation can go on and on for a long time about any topic. He's just so well-rounded. But in general, these discussions that we had, I think is just very enlightening, and people took a lot away because, they're not always looking at it from, how do you relate this back into the organization that you're supporting on the business side of it, which was kind of a key theme that Neil, Adil, as well as Ed brought forth. So it was pretty interesting. There was some technical, discussions. We definitely got into some questions from the audience on those kind of more deeper points. But in general, really good conversations. And it was just good to have, some of our previous guests there live for an event with us. And
I mean, I did the one down in Houston, and we did ones in Chicago, and Washington, D.C. just wrapped up, and we had San Francisco that kicked us off. I hope that we do these again.
Yeah.
So Rob, next Wednesday, we have another guest coming in that's going to be interesting. We've never talked about the public relations side of cybersecurity and how that's important. And who's our guest?
Our guest is going to be Kevin Danino, and he's going to be talking all about crisis management. He comes from more of the traditional, as you said, PR side of things, Dan. but we're going to take that back into some experiences you've been having as it relates to cybersecurity events and how public and private organizations deal with those.
It should be a good one.
All right, Stan, till next time.
Hello, producer Ben here, and you'd have just heard Rob and Stan mention a couple of previous episodes. One was episode 83, featuring Adil Saeed. He's a vice president in technology strategy and execution management at Kyndryl. The edition looked at the importance of data protection in the evolving cybersecurity landscape, and it's called Secure It, Guarding Your Data. The other featured Ed Amoruso, one of the world's first ever CISOs. It's episode 67, called Sustainable Cybersecurity.
Let's say we hadn't seen a cyber hack in the last 10 years. You know what I'd say? Keep doing what you're doing. But if you get one hack after another, each one worse than the last one, didn't you learn when you were in high school playing soccer that if you're losing 18 zip at the half, you do something different? What does best practice even mean when you're losing 60-0? It's insanity. So in cyber, we have to change the game.
That was Ed Amoruso there. Well worth a listen. Now, as normal, I'm going to ask you to rate and review the podcast. But if you really want to help out, then do tell somebody about Reimagining Cyber, in a positive way, of course, because you can't beat word of mouth. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.